It's a pleasure having you back for this edition of your program Décryptage on Africa 24. On the sidelines of the 29th Afreximbank annual meetings held in Cairo in Egypt from June 15 to 18, 2022, we will be receiving as guest Mr. Hippolyte Fofack from Cameroun. He is the Chief Economist and Director of Research and International Cooperation at the African Export-Import Bank, Afreximbank. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Fofack. Africa 24 is pleased to have you. The theme of this 29th Afreximbank annual meetings is realizing the African continental free trade area potential in the post-COVID-19 era, leveraging the power of the youth. Tell us about your vision for the youth in the operationalization of the AFCFTA and some of the initiatives adopted by your department at the Afreximbank to empower the youth in order to realize the potential of this common market.
Thank you very much. I think it's important to stress that the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, the AFCFTA, entered into force in January 2021, really in the midst of the pandemic. And so it was a challenge for it to take off. And yet, the AFCFTA, as you know, has been touted as a game changer. And the free trade agreement has tremendous potential for boosting African trade. Our estimate shows that they could actually increase by more than 30% over the coming decade. And that growth in intra-African trade will be largely driven by manufactured goods, which are essentially highly labor-intensive. Therefore, we create opportunities for millions of young Africans who are entering the job market, who are seeking to enter the job market every year. It's been touted as a game changer because it has potential for trade industrializations. It also has tremendous potential for essentially changing and shifting the distribution of FDI, foreign direct investment, into Africa more toward manufacturing and the benefit that I've just outlined. But it's quite clear to us at Afreximbank that even though the potential of the AFCFTA are significant, both for trade and industrialization, which in the African case will be mutually reinforcing, because intra-African trade is dominated by manufactured goods. So as intra-African trade grows, it will essentially lift manufactured good industrializations. But to us, even though the potential of the AFCFTA are significant, at Afreximbank we believe that the AFCFTA is necessary but not sufficient. To achieve the sufficiency status, we have to actually begin to close the gap in manufacturing output. And this is where the African youth come into play. I think they will play a major role in a world where technology, digitalizations have become important vectors of growth. Specific initiative undertaken by the bank, in particular, to support the African youth. I think you'll be pleased to know that the banks actually launched recently is CANEX, Creative Africa Nexus, to essentially support and really create a dynamic in a growth sector, the creative and cultural industries, which are a tremendous growth sector. Globally, generating more than $2.3 trillion in revenue at the global level and more than 30 million jobs. In that regard, the bank launched a couple of years ago, FEDA, Fund for Export Development in Africa, essentially to say that if you as a young Africans have a very good idea which can be turned into a great product for the benefit of the continent and the world, that idea will not die because of financing gap, lack of financing. And we are supporting those through equity participations in some of those companies, so that, as President Rama often said, no more in this continent will great idea die because of lack of financing. That's another important angle to actually support the youth within the continent. And then we have our incubations, SM incubation program, which essentially is also there to essentially provide support to young startup, young African in that space. And through our research, And we're engaging young across the continent to push them in the research field, to do more economics, but we are going to expand the stream and working with universities to make sure that we bring to them trade finance, to increase knowledge of trade finance, but also expand the scope.
Mr. Fofack, what is your assessment of the growth rate of African economies so far? What are some of the challenges and how can they be met?
And when the pandemic struck, and all the forecasts were that Africa was going to contract by 4-5%. It was going to be Armageddon in the continent. And when the sun set, Africa contracted by just about 1.6%. Prolonged prosperity. I just mentioned the fact that Africa undergone its first recessions in 25 years. She was short. We got out of it the next year. And our forecast is that we entered 2022 actually, from that strong growth, but that incipient recovery from the COVID-19 actually somehow been undermined by geopolitical challenges in the Ukraine. The world 3.4%, down from 4%. But what is quite interesting is that somehow they kept Africa growth forecast for 2022 almost at 4%, which reflect that resilience. But that resilience that we see and the forecast is actually broad-based. If you look at it closely and decompose it, and we have out of more than 50 countries, about 16, where growth rate in 2022 forecast will be above 5%. That's 30%. And this includes both large but also smaller economies. If you take Equatorial Guinea, for instance, which had gone through 4 years of recessions, will be growing by more than 5%. Egypt, 5.9% on the large economy side. But even the country which are not forecast to grow above 5%, we've seen a significant upward revision in the growth forecast. Nigeria, for instance, from 2.1% to 3.4%. From 2.1% in January forecast to 3.4% post-Ukraine crisis. We saw the same story for Angola, another oil-exporting countries. Essentially, the Ukraine crisis has been a positive tailwind for commodity prices, and oil-exporting country in particular are reaping those benefits. So in our forecast, we believe that 2022, despite all the challenges, will actually be a year where Africa will be expanding by around 4 to 4.2%.
You presented the Afreximbank African Trade Report 2022 during the 29th Afreximbank annual meetings in Cairo. Can you give us some of the key findings of this report?
Well, thank you very much. I think it's Afreximbank annual flagship. It's the only African trade report in the world. Trade is highly correlated with growth. As output expands, so is global demand and trade. And so I think trade rebounded strongly as well in 2021 and increasing significantly. And along those lines, I think we saw a strong rebound in African trade, extra-African trade, expanding by more than 30% in 2021. I think that was another big story in the report. And still, we noticed that during the pandemic and the contractions of intra-African trade was actually much smaller than extra-African trade, which reflect indeed the fact that intra-African trade can be seen as an efficient absorber of adverse global shock, negative global shocks. And after that resilience, in 2020, intra-African trade expanded by more than 18% in 2021. And what is also interesting in the report is that despite that rebound in intra-African trade, the share of intra-African trade in total African trade remained very low, less than about 15%, compared to over 70% in Europe, which essentially suggests that there's room to really grow intra-African trade, and that's where the AFCFTA will be a tremendous game changer
Can you tell us how Afreximbank is supporting African economies to quickly recover from the war in Ukraine, which is greatly affecting trade and investment globally?
The bank, as I mentioned earlier, which has become very effective as a counter-cyclical institution, providing support, timely and bold support to shorten crisis, but also extend prosperity, launch our board-approved UCAFPA, Ukraine Crisis Response Facility, to help African countries which are affected through soaring import prices or which have difficulty accessing commodities like wheat, the grain space, fertilizers. In some cases, it's a fiscal through tourism revenues. So our UCAFPA is actually providing timely support to our member countries to mitigate the fallout from this crisis. It's been very well received, and our board approved for billions, but demand on these facilities have largely exceeded 16 billion, the first phase of its implementation.
As a trade finance institution, how can Afreximbank leverage the AfCFTA potential, and what are some of the opportunities presented by the institution to boost the full entry into force of this agreement?
You know very well that Afreximbank, as I said earlier, has invested a lot in the AfCFTA. Afreximbank is working closely with the AfCF Secretariat to make sure that the AfCFTA deliver on its promise and potential just discuss trade. I'll just list a couple of examples. The first one of the key constraints to African trade is trade finance, the financing gap, largely in excess of $120 billion annually. And during our Plan 5, we actually increased the financing of intra-African trade 20 billion. President Rama has indicated that I intend to double that to 40 billion during Plan 6, and to further support AfCFTA implementation, to make sure that financing is no longer a constraint to the growth of intra-African trade in the AfCFTA era.
And that was it for this interview. Thank you for joining us, and stay tuned for more with us on Africa 24.